Hello, it's week 7. This week we look at the rights of people with disabilities. Included in this lesson is a brief history of how people with disabilities gained rights, a look at the UDHR, a look at UN conventions for the rights of people with disabilities, and Australian legislation about disability discrimination. Article 25 of the UDHR says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond their control. Throughout history, people with disabilities have been hidden away, displayed in exhibitions, or discarded and ignored by society. It wasn't until people started returning from various wars in the 20th century that people with disabilities started to be acknowledged as being citizens. One of the earliest recognitions of people with disability was the introduction of the invalid pension in Australia in 1908. This meant that people with disabilities were recognised as being worthy of government support. World War I and World War II made disabilities more visible in Australia because so many soldiers came home from those wars with visible disabilities, with war injuries, with amputations, with psychological problems as well. This meant that the governments realised they had to do something about this, and the government started funding rehabilitation programs, and community treatment rather than institutionalisation was considered for people with disabilities. But it really wasn't until the 1960s and the 1970s that people with disabilities started to be recognised as people who had their own voice. Up until that time, it was mostly people without disabilities who were trying to tell people with disabilities what was best for them. And during the 1960s and 70s, there was a major disability rights movement which coexisted with the civil rights and women's rights movements. Those are all around that same time. People with disabilities protested, they had sit-ins, and it was all in the name of giving people with disabilities more say in how they were treated. Now, for example, there was a peak organisation called Rehabilitation International, which was a very big lobby group for people with disabilities, and it had control of how people with disabilities around the world were treated. But up until 1980, people with disabilities were not allowed to even speak at the meetings of this organisation. Up until that time, they were allowed to observe the proceedings, but they weren't allowed to contribute. And it wasn't until 1981 that they were able to contribute to the proceedings and the decisions made at this organisation. In 1992, the Australian government passed the Disability Discrimination Act, and in 2008, the UN passed a convention for the rights of people with disabilities. So the UN completed the draft of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2006, and it was published in 2008. Australia signed it almost as soon as it was available to be signed in 2008. And the main aim of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was to transform the view of people with disabilities from being objects of pity and people needing help to seeing people with disabilities as people with rights who are capable of claiming those rights, and they were capable of making decisions for their own lives based on their free and informed consent. And it looked at them as being active members of society. So as I said before, Australia passed the Disability Discrimination Act in 1992. People with disabilities are protected from discrimination in employment, education, access to premises used by the public, goods, services and facilities, accommodation, buying land, the activities of clubs and associations, sport, Commonwealth government laws and programs. In these areas of life, people with disabilities must be given equal access and equal opportunity. So if you watch this video here from YouTube, it shows you an example of how the Disability Discrimination Act works. And so you can watch that and fill out the questions which are in the book. I will put a link to this video on the Moodle. So there are two actually models of disabilities, or it's not a model of disability, it's two different ways of seeing people with disabilities. There's what we call the medical model of disability, which says that disability is a health condition which must be dealt with by medical professionals. People with disability are thought to be different from what is normal, and disability is seen to be a problem of the individual. From the medical point of view, a person with a disability is in need of being fixed or cured. The medical model of disability is all about what a person cannot do and cannot be. And nowadays it's a fairly old-fashioned model of disability, and it's one that dominated thinking until quite recently. The social model of disability is the model that, or the point of view that is now most popular. The social model says disability is the result of an interaction between people living with impairments and an environment filled with physical, attitudinal, communication and social barriers. It therefore carries the implication that the barriers and the environment must change to enable people living with impairments to participate in society on an equal basis with others. In effect, the social model of disability sees disability as a society problem, and that society must adapt to ensure that people with disability have equal access to services and opportunities. So, for example, installing a ramp in a building is a classic example of changing the environment so that a person with a disability, such as a person in a wheelchair, has equal access to the services and goods provided in that building. So in the social model of disability, the environment and people's and society's attitudes are seen as the problem rather than as the disabled person having the problem. This YouTube video of Stella Young, a link to which I will put on the Moodle, will give you some idea of what it is like living with a disability in Australia. Stella is unfortunately no longer with us, but Stella is very much a proponent of the social model of disability, and she talks about that. So it's an interesting an interesting TED Talk to watch. Also, if you are interested, there's a documentary called Defiant Lives. This is a good documentary because it's actually an account of the disability rights movement in Australia, the United States and England, and it shows that people with disabilities stood up for their rights, just as African American people stood up for their own rights during the civil rights movement. And it's actually an activist movement that doesn't get a lot of publicity, so it's actually a very interesting watch and look at a certain part of history. So in conclusion, disability rights are protected by international conventions and also by the Australian Disability Discrimination Act. However, despite these international covenants and legal requirements, there are many places and organisations in Australia that do not meet all the requirements of the Disability Discrimination Act and do not give people with disabilities equal access to goods and services and opportunities in education. In fact, even at TAFE you can see some aspects of where we could really improve access for people with disabilities, although TAFE does quite a good job in that area, I think. People who have disabilities may actually disagree with me on that. So it's our obligation as members of society to help with providing equality of access to goods and services for people with disabilities, and to support people with disabilities when they say this is what they need. So I hope you've learned something from today's presentation on disability rights, and I certainly recommend that you watch the documentary Defiant Lives, because it's a very interesting documentary, and before I saw it I had no idea about the disability rights movement, and so it's interesting in that matter as well. Thank you for listening and have a good week. Bye.